Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar hosted by the 21st Century China Center at the School of Global Policy and Strategy, UC San Diego. GPS is a top-ranked professional school devoted to the study of international affairs, economics, and public policy. We offer PhD, master, and bachelor's programs, and one of our master's programs is the Masters of Chinese Economic and Political Affairs, the MCPA program. If you're interested in any of these programs, please check us out at gps.ucsd.edu. I'm Barry Naughton. I'm the Kwan Professor of Chinese International Affairs at GPS at UC San Diego. Thanks for joining our discussion today. The webinar is recorded and will be available on our website, china.ucsd.edu. Please use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. I'll be reading the questions you submit for our speaker during the question and answer period at the end of the presentation. Today, we're delighted to have Dr. Taylor Fravel with us. Dr. Fravel is the Arthur and Ruth Sloan Professor of Political Science and Director of the Security Studies Program at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. For the non-existent people in the audience who don't know what MIT stands for. Taylor is well known for his study of international relations with a focus on security and in particular China and the East Asia region. His books include Strong Borders, Secure Nation, Cooperation and Conflict in China's Territorial Disputes, which came out in 2008. And I've just recently had the pleasure of reading most of his 2019 book, Active Defense, China's Military Strategy Since 1949. He's published in virtually all of the key international relations and political science journals. He's a graduate of Middlebury College, and he got his PhD from Stanford. After Dr. Fravel's presentation, I'll start a conversation, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Welcome, Taylor. The floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Barry and everyone at UCSD for having me. My only regret is that I'm still in Boston, Massachusetts. So let me go ahead and share my screen, make sure this is working. Can everyone see everything? Great, okay. So I'm really delighted to be with you here today and to present brand new work. This is the first time it's being presented that tries to look at the economic effects of joining the Belt and Road for those countries who have formally joined the initiative, with an eye towards trying to better understand how the Belt and Road might serve as a channel for greater Chinese influence in international politics. But really looking forward to your feedback, as this very much still remains a work in progress. So this is a co-authored paper with 4 super talented graduate students pictured here from MIT: Nick Ackert, Eleanor Freund, John Minich, and Raymond Wong. Without them, this paper simply would not have happened. And so I'm presenting on our collective behalf. So we're really focused on 2 main questions, but they're closely related. The first is, how do states who participate in the BRI gain economically after joining? And does participation in the BRI increase China's influence over states who do join? And as you can see here, we're looking at economic interactions as a way of trying to get leverage on how the BRI might be a tool of influence for China in international politics more broadly. This question is important for several reasons, or answering these questions are important for several reasons. First, we try to provide a first cut at systematically evaluating the BRI's effectiveness, at least in the economic domain. So we're looking at all countries who join and comparing them against all countries who don't join. We're trying to do so to help sort of clarify what impact the BRI will have on international politics, and specifically to what degree it will increase Chinese influence either over specific states or in international politics more generally. We also hope that this will help improve sort of the understanding of influence and how it operates within sort of the context of international relations theory. So quick summary, in case I forget where I'm going in the talk, and you know where I'm headed. But we have 2 main conclusions. We'll discuss the implications of these conclusions at the end, or 2 main findings. First is that the economic impact of the BRI in member states is quite uneven. Member states are more likely to receive contract funding or construction contracts than similar states who don't join the BRI. They may gain a bit more in overseas sort of development finance or an increase in exports, although this finding is less robust, as I'll discuss. They're not more likely than non-BRI states to receive more FDI or greater debt relief. And moreover, many of these gains appear to wane after 2 or 3 years. In other words, they don't seem to accumulate over time. If anything, they seem to attenuate over time. And then looking at case studies, specifically probing at sort of these construction contracts linked to contract funding, indicates that sort of the mechanism by which China seems to really increase its influence is by consolidating ties with states with whom it is already closely aligned. And there's little direct evidence for other mechanisms of influence, such as coercion or enhancing public opinion. So those are the main findings. Let me talk now about our assumptions and our approach. So our approach here is really to follow the money and to look at potential channels or look at channels of potential influence that economic interactions with China after joining the BRI might create. And so there's a lot of discussion about the BRI as a source of China's increasing influence in the world. And to sort of assess that claim, we want to look at how states join, sort of benefit economically or not, compared with states who do not. And then in those areas where we see BRI member states benefiting more than states who do not join, we then try to sort of dig down into more detail to see what mechanisms by which this area of interaction might be increasing Chinese influence. I want to make a caveat here, though, right? We're not making claims about China's overall influence, even through economic interactions. We're really trying to assess the marginal impact of the Belt and Road Initiative. But we do so because, as I mentioned, right, the Belt and Road Initiative is often seen as a tool by which China will increase its influence. And so I think it's important to try to understand this marginal influence versus, say, other ways in which Chinese influence might be exercised. And to do so, we have we conduct two kinds of analyses in the paper. Using panel data, we compare sort of 4 economic outcomes for BRI and non-BRI states to try to understand whether there are any systematic trends. And I'll discuss this method in a bit more detail in the next few slides. And then in those areas where we find sort of the greatest increase in sort of economic gains for BRI states, we use a most likely sort of case study research design to examine in a few select cases how influence might be exercised by China. And so we're trying to sort of take a systematic sort of first cut across all states and then probe deeply into a few to see how things might be working. Let me talk a little bit about different mechanisms of influence that draws on the literature of sort of economic statecraft. One can think about influence in sort of a direct or an indirect way. This is sort of a very standard definition of influence in terms of the direct conceptualization, when one actor A gets another actor B to do what B would otherwise not do, which really focuses on shaping actor B's preferences or its behavior. And it can do so sort of directly through sort of threats or inducements, or it can do so somewhat indirectly through agenda setting, but very much focused on kind of altering preferences or policies. And then there's a more indirect way in which influence can be exercised through economics and economic statecraft, which is to strengthen ties with states when preferences or behavior might already be in alignment, but sort of further consolidating that relationship and immunizing it from sort of any potential threats. So this sort of yields sort of 4 mechanisms of influence, the 5 mechanisms of influence, excuse me. The first 4 here come from an article that Scott Kastner and Margaret Pearson wrote earlier this year, which is a really terrific way, sort of a framing piece on how to think about economic statecraft and influence. We draw upon this quite heavily, but coercion would be the first method, leveraging some kind of dependency to change an actor's policy. And here in the context of the BRI, we could think of this in terms of perhaps debt trap diplomacy. So once a country is really indebted, China can then use threats of not refinancing or other kinds of threats to get that actor to change its behavior. And the converse would be inducements, basically promising sort of some sort of economic gain or benefit in exchange for pursuing preferences or in exchange for pursuing policies that would align with China's preferences. Thirdly, you can look at the role of the creation of interest groups that might then, which would be groups who benefit from economic interaction with another country, in this case, China, and then lobby their government to adopt policies in turn that are favorable towards China. And then you can look at sort of public or elite opinion, whereby these economic interactions create more favorable views of China in the host or in the target country, that then leads leaders of that country to adopt sort of more favorable policies in response. And then finally, kind of what we're calling the consolidation sort of mechanism of influence, which is sort of much broader. This draws on some earlier work by Evelyn Go and her collaborators, which looks at this idea of kind of strengthening ties in areas where preferences are already aligned or overlapping, and sort of consolidating a relationship that may be useful, certainly in international politics in the future, but does not witness kind of the same sort of direct forms of influence that we might associate with the first four mechanisms. So again, just to recap here, first we're going to see in which economic interactions BRI member states participate more than non-BRI member states. And then once we identify those interactions, it really will focus on construction contracts for the purposes of this paper. We're then going to probe more deeply in some case studies to see how these specific mechanisms of influence might be triggered or might be operating. So in terms of our sort of the first half of the analysis, we use a new tool called Panel Match, which was developed in part by a colleague of mine at MIT, In-Sung Kim. And this has sort of been released this year. It's sort of a matching method for panel data, which is exactly kind of what we are working with in looking at BRI member states and comparing them to non-BRI member states. And basically what it does is it identifies a matched set of control units where there's identical treatment histories prior to treatment as the treated units. In this case, the treated units are those who joined the Belt and Road Initiative, which we are drawing actually on a previous paper that most of us have worked on, which identifies when sort of specifically states formally join the BRI. And then from this group, this tool Panel Match refines the match set using a variety of techniques, and then finally uses differences approach to estimate the treatment effects based upon a counterfactual from kind of the match set. So basically, comparing a state who joins the BRI in a certain economic domain and the outcome in that domain with sort of a set of countries who are quite similar but don't join the BRI, averaging the effects and then comparing them to see if there's a meaningful difference. So this is quite a powerful tool, specifically for the kind of question that we're trying to answer. So what we do more specifically is how we apply this. We're looking at 4 domains. Construction contracts, sometimes also called contract funding. This is when a Chinese bank lends money to a country to then hire a Chinese firm to build a road or a bridge or usually some other infrastructure project. Overseas development finance, exports from the BRI country to China, and then China's FDI in the BRI country, or foreign direct investment. And we're looking at all states who joined between 2013 and 2017 to try to assess the effect of memberships on a 3-year period after joining. And so one limitation of this tool in the context of the BRI is you can only really gauge the meaningful effect if you're able to compare economic outcomes over a period of time after joining. And basically, we only have data for all countries through 2020, which means that we can only assess those states who joined the BRI in sort of its first 4 years. But we can talk more about sort of potential challenges that might pose, but this ought to be the group of countries where we might see a lot of influence because in essence, they were the early adopters, and also China was probably quite keen for the BRI to be successful in these states. And so then we use all this to try to determine the economic effect of membership, again, for this 3-year period, kind of pre and post. So let me go through the results for the 4 main areas, starting with contract funding from China. As I mentioned, these are construction contracts typically financed by Chinese banks. The data here comes from the China Global Investment Tracker, which is a great resource for both contract funding and FDI. It includes any product over $100 million, which appears to be about 90% of construction contracts. So it doesn't include quite everything, but it includes most. And this is a tricky area to assess or to measure. And the results here show that it's pretty clearly a plausible pathway for influence. And if we look at the chart on sort of the right-hand side of the slide, what you can see is 4 time periods. So the T+1 is the year in which the state enters or joins the BRI formally. And then T+1 is 1 year after joining, T+2 is 2 years, and T+3 is 3 years. And you can see certainly a pretty significant increase. And if we sort of convert this into percentage terms, by T2, it's roughly a 230% increase in contract funding for those states who joined the BRI compared with similar states who did not join the BRI. But also it looks like it may be potentially short-lived with a pretty significant dip in the 3rd year. And of course, there is not statistical significance across all 4 observations, but certainly in the 1st and the 3rd observation. So this is why later on in the case studies, we're going to focus on contract funding, because this is where it really seems that the economic interactions are most different between states who join the BRI and states who don't. And in some ways, this is not surprising given the focus of the BRI on infrastructure, but nevertheless is still important to document and to try to get a sense of its magnitude. Now turning to overseas development finance. This is official development lending, typically from state-owned banks. Here we use data from my colleagues at BU and their Chinese Overseas Development Finance database, which I believe is gathering data from 2 main Chinese lenders. And what you see is that there's an increase in ODF, but in no years is it statistically significant. And by the 2nd year, it's about only roughly a 30% increase in ODF for BRI states compared to similar states who don't join the BRI. So not nearly as sort of substantively large as contract funding, and also, of course, not significant. Now, there is some greater uncertainty here because there's fewer observations. I think it's about 850 loans are included in this database. And so if we had sort of better data, we might have a different result, but this is the best data that we have to date for this time period, being able to look through, again, 2020. Turning now to exports to China, right? The idea is that if you join the BRI, especially given its focus on connectivity, perhaps you would be more likely to sell more to China. That would be another channel of influence. Here we just look at the annual goods BRI member states export to China. We use UN data. And what we see is an increase, but again, it may be short-lived, and in no period is it statistically significant, excuse me. And by year 2 in T2, it's about a 25% increase that BRI member states may enjoy relative to similar non-BRI member states. Now, one point to note here, right, is the true impact on exports might take a much longer period of time to manifest if it's dependent upon specific kinds of infrastructure, particularly ports, perhaps, and also railways being built in target countries. And so one would want to look out, look out many more years, perhaps, than we do. But again, given the relative novelty of the BRI on the international stage and kind of the limitations of the data that I mentioned, just in terms of needing to sort of halt the analysis in 2020, we are unable to do so. But it also may be the case that there is not much of an impact of the BRI on exports. Finally, we look at FDI or direct monetary investments by foreign firms into BRI countries, and specifically by Chinese firms. Again, we use the China Global Investment Tracker data here. And here we see no significant effect of the BRI and FDI. And in fact, it's a decline of roughly, I think, 45% once we convert this into percentage terms by year 2. And this should not be surprising if I could show you another map, which is to say that China's outward FDI rate has been very heavily concentrated, not in relatively poor countries, but in it's been concentrated in advanced industrialized societies, particularly Europe, and for a period of time in America. So right, to sum up here, we look at 4 potential channels of influence that economic interactions might create. And we identify construction contracts or contract funding as sort of the most likely channel to date through which the BRI would allow China to increase influence over those states who join. Now let me turn to debt relief, which is a slightly different, required slightly different analysis. Our hunch here was that countries who joining the BRI should be more likely to receive debt relief from China, but we don't have the same kind of systematic data that we can use to deploy panel match. And so what we did instead was looked at sort of a set of most likely cases, which were those countries in spring of 2020 when COVID erupted onto the world stage, who requested debt relief from China. So I think there are about 75 or so eligible countries, and 28 of these requested debt relief from China. And then we looked at to see of these 28 whether or not BRI participants received any kind of preferential treatment. And here we're sort of facing the tyranny of low numbers, as well as the sort of just problems in terms of determining whether or not relief was actually granted. It's not always being publicly discussed or announced. But what we found is the majority of countries who requested relief received it. But if one sort of compares the BRI countries with the non-BRI countries, it actually turns out that BRI countries were slightly less likely to receive debt relief. But that may be due in part to the fact that most of the countries who did request debt relief were BRI countries, and so the comparison set was just quite limited. But if we're thinking about how China might have used debt relief to exercise influence, we conduct one other kind of analysis, which is to compare two letters that were sent to the UN Human Rights Commission on Xinjiang, one in 2019 and one in 2020. And so sort of pre and post COVID and pre and post debt relief requests to see whether or not China uses debt relief sort of coercively to gain support for its position with regards to its policies and behavior in Xinjiang. What we find is 4 countries who didn't sign the 2019 letter in support of China did sign the 2020 letter, and they appeared to do so after receiving debt relief. So this is a plausible way through which China may have used debt relief for political purposes and as an example of coercion, but we don't have any direct evidence. We only have sort of the correlation when relief was granted and when countries subsequently signed the letter. So let me turn now to the case studies that we conducted and talk a little bit about the method. So we wanted, within the area of contract funding or construction contracts, first identify those countries who benefited most or received the most value of these contracts in either absolute or relative terms, and that should be perhaps most susceptible to being influenced by China. So we sort of created 2 top 10 lists, those countries who sort of for whom the value of these contracts increased the most after joining the BRI versus compared to the period before joining, and then those whose sort of contract funding increased the most in relative terms, relative to the previous amounts China had invested. And then we looked for overlap, but we excluded energy and raw materials exporters who've had long-standing ties with China and long-standing sort of construction contracts with China to support those industries. And we didn't think we would find as much in those countries as we might find in other countries. And this led us to look at Cambodia, Serbia, and Madagascar. And so in the few minutes that I have left, I'll try to go through these cases quickly. But sort of the bottom line is we don't find in most of them really any evidence for the 4 main mechanisms of influence that we talked about at the beginning, but we do find evidence that China is really consolidating already close ties through these construction contracts. We'll sort of highlight that in a minute. So starting with Cambodia, Cambodia joined the BRI in 2016, and you can see right that it's the value of construction contracts grew massively 3 years before joining to 3 years afterwards, from 1.1 to 9.6 billion. But this, of course, is a country with whom China's had long-standing ties. Cambodia became a sort of a client state after political upheaval in 1997 and the imposition of sanctions by the United States and many other countries. And China's Cambodia's largest trading partner and its largest foreign investor, right? So in many dimensions, China and Cambodia are already very close. And before Cambodia joined the BRI, right, it was pretty closely aligned with China on a variety of issues, from Taiwan to Xinjiang and to the politics of sort of the disputes in the South China Sea. So looking at the mechanisms of influence, so we find strong evidence right, that the BRI through construction contracts has sort of further entrenched certain vested interest groups that are linked to the regime in Cambodia, and thus more generally serve as a vehicle for consolidating already close ties. But we don't find much evidence for the mechanisms of influence in other areas. So in terms of debt, China does hold a pretty significant share of Cambodia's foreign debt, but its debt to GDP ratio is not that great, which suggests that perhaps China's leverage here would be limited, of course, acknowledging, right, that Cambodia in general is quite reliant on China already. In terms of inducements, obviously Cambodia has helped to build a lot of infrastructure and other projects in Cambodia, but we already saw, as I mentioned previously, right, Cambodia continued, or Cambodia was already sort of aligned with China on lots of at least international political issues, as well as issues relating to Xinjiang and Taiwan. What is really interesting is vested interest groups. And here we see the BRI funding sort of directly going to key regime supporters. And so there's this title that the Cambodian leader bestows on his closest followers, which is in part linked to how much money they contribute to the state. And many of these have been directly, and they're called Okna, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And many of these individuals might have been directly involved in BRI projects. They've attended BRI summits. They've signed their own MOUs for projects and appear to be getting kickbacks directly through these projects, and in turn are, of course, big supporters of the regime. And so in that sense, China's sort of construction contracts are not only kind of consolidating sort of the overall political relations, but actually perhaps helping to keep Hun Sen himself in power. Interestingly, with public opinion, although there's not great data coming out of Cambodia, one sees sort of China being increasingly viewed negatively with frictions over forced displacement linked to Chinese-funded projects, as well as environmental damage, and what has come to be China's kind of monopoly position, sort of position in the tourist industry, at least as it relates to Chinese tourists. That's not really, thus tourists, which are often an important source for any developing economy, are perhaps not contributing as much to Cambodians as otherwise might be the case. Turning to Serbia, Serbia joined a year earlier than Cambodia and also experienced a very significant increase in the value of construction contracts before and after joining. China is an important economic partner for Serbia, but not as important as the EU or Russia. And so it's sort of the third sort of largest source of imports during this period, or shifted from the fourth to the third largest source of imports during this period. But China's never been a significant export market for Serbia. And before joining the BRI, you already had pretty close ties on key questions in international politics, focusing on sovereignty that were a consequence of the 1999 Kosovo War and how that played out. And so you've seen Serbia provide support over Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and other issues as relates to China. Here again, we see vested interest groups perhaps playing a role, but more generally, what this increase in contract funding seems to do is consolidate this already close relationship. At the same time, the boost that China might have expected to public opinion on more favorable views as a result of these investments haven't really panned out either, which might have something to do with the fact that these vested interest groups are benefiting most. In terms of kind of coercion that might sort of take place through debt traps, Serbia is not overly reliant on China, and so we didn't find any evidence here that China was using its debt in this way. China holds about 7% of Serbia's debt, and Serbia's debt to GDP ratio is higher than Cambodia's, but still not sort of at the levels of real distress in which perhaps this might create leverage. And China sort of lags behind other creditors, particularly the EU and Eurobonds, as well as international financial institutions. With respect to inducements, there might be some evidence here that China's more flexible financing along with Serbia's continued support for Xinjiang are related. But again, we were unable to find too much direct evidence. In terms of vested interest groups, though, you see China investing significantly in sort of aging industries in Serbia, which are seen as important for local jobs. And the Serbian government even has sort of relaxed or altered its standard procurement rules as a way to kind of fast track additional Chinese projects. And so I'm sure some of this perhaps is going directly to the Serbian government as well. But then when we turn to public opinion, Despite this increase in lending, you don't see a corresponding increase in sort of favorable views of China. And you see China pulling considerably less well than Russia, even though Russia invests far less. And even for 5G, right, Japan pulled ahead of China. There was this bump in popularity that we identified in one poll in March of 2020, but we believe this is due to COVID-related assistance and not to the Belt and Road Initiative. Finally, in terms of the last country to look at is Madagascar. Madagascar joined a bit later in 2017, and the value of contracts before and after sort of joining in a 3-year period rose from 150 to roughly 1.4 billion. Now, China's had a pretty substantial economic presence since the 1990s and has become sort of Madagascar's largest source of imports since 2003, and is also a pretty important destination, although not a top destination for Madagascar's exports. Also, unlike many Western nations, China did not reduce its economic engagement in 2009 when there was a coup in Madagascar. And so in some ways, Madagascar, sort of China's influence is based upon the fact that it chose to remain in Madagascar and remain economically engaged in particular, unlike other countries. Again, turning to mechanisms of influence, there's sort of not a lot of great evidence here in the area of construction contracts. We believe, right, that China's greatest increase in influence occurred before it joined the BRI as a result of sort of the continued Chinese presence following the coup. But it also may be too soon to tell. Most of the increase in the value of construction contracts to Madagascar is tied to a single deep water port, and construction of that project has not yet started, right? So we may need to revisit this case, but nevertheless, we thought it was important to include in our case study analysis one country from Africa that had gained significantly. So in terms of debt, Madagascar, we find no evidence of sort of coercion or debt traps being exercised. Madagascar's debt to GDP ratio is about 50%, which is pretty moderate. And China's far and away not the largest lender. We don't know exactly how much of Madagascar's debt China holds, but we do know that the World Bank and the African Development Bank hold over 50%. And assuming that there are other lenders in the mix as well, China is not as significant a lender in that sense. No evidence yet, right, that these contracts have been used as inducements. Madagascar did not sign any of the letters in support of China's position on Xinjiang, even after receiving this very large amount of funding for the deepwater port. No evidence for vested interest groups that might be sort of reliant on China and either support the local regime, the local government, excuse me, or help shape its policies in a way that are favorable towards China. And in another context, we've seen interest groups organize against the Chinese presence. So here, this is a case where China's presence perhaps has been controversial, not unlike sort of China's presence in the tourist industry in Cambodia. And in terms of public opinion, there's never been really strong support in Madagascar. According to the latest Afrobarometer poll from 2020, only about 50% of citizens hold a positive or favorable view of China. And there have been sort of unrest associated with Chinese factories. So that wraps up sort of the case study analysis. Let me conclude here briefly with some implications before turning it back to you, Barry. I think there's at least 4 implications, maybe more. So like China's potential, right, to gain influence to the BRI is pretty mixed and potentially short-lived, at least according to our aggregate analysis, which should induce some caution into attributing the BRI as a tool through which China will significantly increase its influence, again, at least in the parameters of what we studied and when we studied it. What we seem to find is that the main effect is not sort of using contract funding as a way of sort of changing the policies or behaviors of recipient states, but instead sort of consolidating ties with states with whom China already has, in some cases, pretty close ties. In the case of Cambodia and Serbia, these are close political ties, as well as in the case of Cambodia and Madagascar, somewhat close economic ties. Thirdly, contract funding seems to work mostly through interest groups and potentially elites through those interest groups. This does not seem really to improve public opinion in any of the countries we mentioned. A related implication that I meant to add to the slide but didn't is that in all three cases, right, China's pre-existing influence is perhaps due to the fact that Western countries in the United States in particular were not heavily involved in their economies for a variety of reasons, whether that be sort of for political reasons in Cambodia, the Kosovo reasons and sort of Kosovo War is well known, or perhaps what has happened in Madagascar in terms of the coup. And then finally, the importance of contract funding, I think, lends support to the view that the BRI or China's motives for the BRI is driven significantly by a desire to outsource surplus capacity, because this, of course, is the way in which it would be most readily or handily outsourced. So with that, I'll conclude. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Taylor. That's a fantastic paper. It's incredibly rich, and I really like the multi-method approach where you're using the cross-country quantitative approach to make a lot of generalizations. They're well supported, and then diving deep into the case studies that really illuminate the specifics. So congratulations, it's a great paper. Let me raise a couple of questions. The first one is actually the first thing that somebody in the Q&A box raised as well. The anonymous questioner, I don't know who it is, said, why do you say they joined the BRI? Since this is as far as I understand, it simply involves putting your name on a piece of paper that says, yeah, I'm in the BRI, and it involves no other obligations or anything. So how should we understand the real significance of this variable, which after all is your most important explanatory variable?
Great, thanks, Barry, and thanks, Anonymous. Really good question. So this draws in part on another paper in this project that we've been working on, which looks at, in essence, kind of the determinants of why states join the BRI. And the definition we used in that paper, which we carried over into this paper, was to officially join by signing a memorandum of understanding to pursue cooperation under the framework of the Belt and Road. And so on the one hand, these MOUs are relatively cheap talk. They contain no commitments. They're not legally binding. They're non-renewable, or they have to be renewed. They usually have durations of 3 to 5 years. But they do signal, right, an intent upon the part of the country signing the MOU with China to take part in the BRI and to pursue greater development with China under the BRI. Of course, these MOUs that are used to sort of describe the scope of the BRI. So you now can see maps showing, I think as of 2020, 124 countries who've joined, which makes it look really big and consequential. And I think both the BRI's greatest proponents and perhaps its greatest critics focus a lot on participation for a variety of reasons. For its proponents, which I would say maybe largely the propagandists in Beijing, right? You now see articles in Xinhua talking about China's growth in exports along the trade and along the Belt and Road. And so what they do is they sum up exports of every country who signed an MOU and then rebrand that, right, as some big effect of the BRI. And so, and likewise, those who are really worried about the BRI will look to the fact that many countries have decided to formally join. And so we wanted to use this as a way of then assessing what impact the BRI had, because China's kind of ascribing importance to it. Actually, sort of those worried about it are ascribing importance to joining. And it seemed the best way to sort of try to systematically understand how these countries who have chosen to formally participate may have benefited or not. And you know, the alternative, you know, might have been to try to use some specific you know, project as a way to determine that. But getting data on sort of BRI specific projects is challenging. Even the China Global Investment Tracker, which we use and is great data, tends to count as BRI projects any project that occurs after the state joins the BRI. Right?
Sure.
And so I mean, to sum up, right, the MOUs seem to be the most readily available and reasonably defensible way of trying to conduct the analysis.
Sure, and it is totally defensible. But since you're facing this challenge of coordinating this extremely rich and complex paper, it matters a lot, sort of exactly how you treat membership. And your methodology, which is very, very sophisticated, right? Because it picks out the event. It's like the best methodology we have. I mean, assuming I understand it as a version of propensity score matching, it picks out, the impact of this specific event. But when you discuss the conclusions, you actually don't believe in the impact of this specific event very much, because you said consolidating ties with states already closely aligned is one of the key impacts. So I wonder if there isn't perhaps a little bit of a shuffling of position that could be done here that might strengthen the way some of the parts of the paper are tied together. I mean, in a way, I read part of this as saying, well, companies sign BRI memos when they've got a bunch of construction projects coming down the pike. And China says, we're going to fund your highway and your dam. And oh, by the way, would you please sign the memo to show that we're friends? Which is plausible to me, but it's a little bit different in terms of thinking about the processes than just thinking about whether BRI has these economic effects or not.
Yeah. I will say in the previous paper, we kind of look at determinants of who joins. We found that poor infrastructure using this World Bank infrastructure index was not associated with joining. And so that may help us continue, I mean, we should definitely probe that in the cases, right, to see if this is what's happening, right? Did Madagascar have this port, on the works and was trying to find a funder for a decade and no one would bite, and then China comes along. But at least in the previous analysis, we didn't see it. There wasn't a close link in that work between kind of the quality of your infrastructure and your sort of the likelihood that you might join.
Right. I mean, and then somewhat parallel to that is when you're measuring the effect, when you're measuring the economic effect, the things that you're measuring are, they deal with the country as a whole, as an economy. But then in your case studies, what you really isolate, and I think this is one of the best parts of the paper, it's super interesting, is the way that specific elite groups benefit from specific side deals. And you can call that corruption, or you can call it, but it's not necessarily corruption per se, but it's certainly a very disproportionate impact for a certain class of politicians versus sort of the people as a whole. So again, there's a little bit of it's not a contradiction or anything, but it's a little bit of a disconnect between method and conclusion. And I saw that most there's a figure you had in the paper you didn't put on the screen with channels and instruments.
Oh, right, yeah.
And it seemed to me, I don't know, I looked at that and I thought, well, the channels are not really prerequisites for the instruments in some cases, right?
That's a good point. I mean, we'll have to think more about that. To do the systematic analysis, I think we have to use indicators for the economy as a whole. But I think maybe what you're suggesting and we can work more on is to focus on disaggregating that maybe even more than we do and looking at the constituent parts, because it could play out in lots of different kinds of projects in different ways.
I mean, in a way, the results are highly convincing because they show, kind of what you would expect, that construction projects funded by state banks are desirable to recipient countries, and they're strongly associated with signing BRI, and FDI, which is driven by all kinds of other things, isn't. That makes a lot of sense. It also, I think, corresponds to the quality of the data, right? The FDI data is pretty crummy, despite the good work, that AEI has done on it, but it's still pretty weak, whereas the construction data is pretty good. So I mean, that's a kind of could be a just a baseline then for the discussion of the other effects without necessarily making that the crux of the paper per se, even though it's great. So anyway, these are just ideas. A couple of questions have including some by Susan and Kwan, are asking what speculations do you have about the incentives of the countries that join BRI? What do they get? And does anybody ever leave BRI? Has anybody ever quit?
Great. So in the previous paper, we were able to get a hold of about, don't quote me exactly on the number, 22 to 25 of these BRI MOUs. They're quite short, 3 to 5 pages. They kind of include the usual kind of Chinese boilerplate of win-win and so forth. And then specific provisions in terms of duration, not being binding, and what other things you would find in perhaps in a lot of other MOUs. And so, but looking at the text of these specific MOUs, the argument that we sort of developed in the other paper is that joining BRI really is a pretty low cost event, right? Especially in the beginning when so much money was associated with it. And so we forward the argument that most states should join the BRI unless they have a really good reason not to, right? Unless they see the cost is higher. And then we tested that against 2 specific arguments. One, that democracies in general would be less likely to join the BRI because they wouldn't want to be seen as supporting large authoritarian state. And then we also speculated that countries with close security ties with the United States would also be less likely to join because they might be risking those ties. And we measured the latter in terms of whether or not a country has a base or whether or not a country hosts a US base. And what we found is that far and away the most robust finding is democracy. Occasionally, under certain specifications, you might find a little bit of effect for bases, but typically at the end we didn't. And so it really seems like, in the heady days, right, leading into 2015 to 17 in the first form, and maybe even 2019, it was like, well, why not join? Because we might get more out of it, and we at least need to sort of signal intent to China that we want to benefit. So that's the explanation that we put forward in that paper. And we have a couple of paired case studies comparing very similar countries using a matching tool, and then just looking at those who are democracies versus non-democracies. And it seems like it's a pretty plausible argument, and it fits well with the data. Now, countries can leave, and we may be in the window where we may see more countries leave. I believe the only country that has left to date, although my co-authors may correct me, has been Romania, which left sometime last year over growing concerns about China. It basically chose, I think, not to renew. And so most of these agreements, as I mentioned, last between 3 and 5 years. And I think you could just let it lapse, or you could publicly decide that you're not going to renegotiate it. And Romania sort of went public with not renegotiating it. And given that a lot of countries joined in starting in 2016 and 17, we're now in a window with the next few years where we may see more countries deciding not to renew their MOUs, or China and these countries not announcing new MOUs, which you could take as a non-renewal, I think. Although that will be a little bit harder to document. So it's certainly possible to leave, formally leave the initiative if you formally join, or there's just the leaving by ignoring a way of dealing with it as well.
Has China retaliated against Romania in any way? It's too early to tell, I'm sure.
I think it may be too early to tell.
Is that, sorry?
I think it may be too early to tell. Yeah. Romania just, I'll have to go back and look at the specifics.
Kind of a funny, least likely case.
Yeah.
Minya has a really interesting question. She says, Taylor, great paper. You convinced me that BRI is not generating influence for China, but then can you elaborate on what you think are the gains to China's influence? And also maybe on that basis, speculate why the US and other countries are so worried and give so much pushback to BRI.
Well, I think at least on the worry part first, quite, China, and lavish so much attention on the BRI, right, as this signature initiative, writing it into various party documents and constitutions, and it's now like the BRI will never go away, right, because it's been codified by the party. Now the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and lots of other things haven't gone away that we don't talk about as much anymore. So the BRI could kind of die a slow death, I suppose. But yeah, it was so closely associated with this period in which power was seen as shifting, in which the United States, I think, was seen as on its back foot, in which China was leveraging its best, its like most lucrative, most useful asset, right? Its market and its cold hard cash in ways that simply other, in the United States and other advanced economies can't compete in terms of the volume of lending. And so and obviously where it was going was uncertain. And so I think that explains why the attention was given to it, in part because China was giving a lot of attention to it, and a lot of countries seem to be interested. In terms of influence, it might support this idea of spheres of influence, or what Nadège Roland has described as kind of partial hegemony. So China's going to consolidate ties in different, I wouldn't even say necessarily regions of the world, although some of them may be regions, but with certain kinds of countries. These countries were probably never close to the US or the West more generally to begin with, but it will have a closer set of ties. I don't want to call it a bloc, because I think that is not the right concept, but certainly countries with whom China will have very close political relationships, which it can leverage in the UN and in other areas. I think there the question is, right, is China kind of flipping countries that used to be more sort of leaning more, say, towards the United States or other advanced industrialized democracies, or is it simply consolidating? And it appears really more it's kind of in this consolidation sort of direction. So it won't be inconsequential for that reason, but it won't necessarily be as transformative as I think maybe China hoped, or again, as I think its critics feared.
So I mean, in a sense, one of the ways you are bringing this together is by saying, look, the event of joining BRI isn't that significant. And so we don't see much evidence of flipping countries. But of course, when we draw back and look at the bigger picture, we still see patterns of influence, spheres of influence. I mean, of course, one country that didn't get mentioned in this paper is Pakistan.
Yes.
Which I think is probably, for a lot of people, be the first country that people think of when they think of BRI. Do you want to talk about that?
I don't.
I mean, it fits what you're saying for sure.
Yeah, no, I mean that's. You mean talk about Pakistan in particular, or? Yeah, I mean, I think Pakistan would be a great example of that line of thinking, right? So Pakistan is probably the country apart from North Korea with whom China has a sort of the closest political military relationship, notably through arms sales. China even manufactures certain airplanes, right, for sale to Pakistan, first and foremost. And this is a long-standing kind of relationship, although has had its ups and downs. And of course, Pakistan was really prioritized, I think, early on in the Belt and Road. And the sums of money associated with Pakistan, I want to say, are 60 billion. I don't have the data at the tips of my finger, but a lot of money, right? But it would, I think, fit this consolidation hypothesis. Although one, I suppose, could make the case that when the U.S. was more heavily involved in Afghanistan, China really did want to consolidate Pakistan more. And in 2013, 14, 15, it may have been uncertain how long the United States would stay in Afghanistan. We now know sort of how that story has ended. But clearly, I think Pakistan would fit with that. But the question would also be, I think, how much of this investment would China have done had it not launched the Belt and Road with Pakistan? It probably would have done a lot of what it's already doing now. I think that might be one other theme from the paper in some ways. I mean, maybe it's beyond the specific analysis, but at least the thought experiment would be for lots of these countries, what would China have done had it not packaged up all these potential interactions as Belt and Road activity and just pursued greater investment, greater connectivity, and so forth.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and so Pakistan, I gather, I mean, it's not in your list of the 10 countries that benefited the most from the BRI joining. And I guess broadening that result is to say that, it already had such a substantial involvement that the actual signing the BRI memo didn't really make any difference. On the other hand, for people who are concerned about BRI as a signal of China's desire to expand into a sphere of influence, the fact that BRI, involved ultimately $50–60 billion of investment and connection of infrastructure and connection of electronic infrastructure, they would say, oh no, it's a perfect example of how much a country benefits from BRI and over which China has leverage, right?
Yeah, I wish I was better prepared to answer your Pakistan questions. I didn't review some of the details, but I think only a third of that amount has actually even begun to be put to work. And a lot of the projects have encountered a lot of pushback. And so I think how you would evaluate the effectiveness in Pakistan would depend upon, what your starting point was. And I think there are other reasons why one might view Pakistan still perhaps as a reason why countries might join, but the experience wasn't necessarily as smooth as anticipated, despite already being very close politically and kind of strategically.
We have a great question here from Anu Anwar. Ask, is there any evidence that some of the BRI projects are host country driven and initiated rather than by Beijing? And if so, does that, do you think that creates a different dynamic and different implication?
That's a great question, and I think something we just need to look at it in the cases, and we didn't yet sort of probe to see who was sort of the prime initiator, and I think we really need to understand that, and that will help significantly. I think my hunch is for lots of these projects, the host country had probably wanted to do some of them for a while, maybe others. And then there was sort of more funding that became available. I don't know how many of them were probably not really conceived of by the host country at some point. So in that sense, it would probably be host country driven, but maybe China helps choose among them. I mean, there must be a large menu for many of these places of potential projects. And maybe China decides, for reasons I don't yet know, it would rather fund projects of this type versus that type, and thus still helping decide which ones are ultimately pursued.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. We're just about out of time. I have one question queued up from Victor Shee for quite a while. He asked, what about imports from the BRI countries from China? And he's especially interested in technology and military technology and stuff like that. But did you look at the import side? Does that increase when a country does it?
We did not. We were sort of saving imports for a third paper that looks more at how China benefits from the BRI, because that would be more benefit that would accrue to China in the aggregate, right? If it's growing markets or growing market share. But we did not look at specific. But we basically didn't look at imports for the purpose of this paper.
Hang in there, Victor. It's coming. Well, great. We try to end these right smack dab on time. This is a fantastic paper. Again, so rich. I think it raises the bar on both the quantitative studies and the case studies. It's a great work, and it gives us plenty to talk about and plenty to caveat about. So, Taylor, thanks for being here today. We really appreciate it. This webinar will be available in the next couple of days on our website, china.ucsd.edu. And please join us again for the upcoming public events. China Capital Goes Global, Anxious China, and When National Identity meets conspiracy. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for the great questions.